There was even some nonsensical thing that it only affected Chinese people. I don't know if people remember that, but that was actually a news item. But I remember thinking, wow, I know Wuhan. Wuhan's the most polluted city on the planet Earth. My favorite, though, was a photo in Italy, right? And you have these two guys suited to the max. You know, it looks like they were on their way to the moon. And you're like, oh, my God. And standing behind them were two guys in suits, not dressed up at all.
Stories about respirator makers, same thing. They had stories about mask makers. They had stories about, you know, they turned getting the vaccine into like a patriotic thing, doing the duty.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do. But only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I have a returning guest, Ken McCarthy. He's been involved with the early internet, still is involved today in helping marketers understand and navigate the internet, pioneered, you know, very frankly, a lot of the technologies everyone uses every day on the internet for marketing and for consumption of content. Over the past, I would say, 2+ years, which is what we're going to talk about today, he's been involved blogging and writing every single day about what's been going on with COVID and all the treachery and BS that's surrounding it. So as a listener, you may agree, you may not agree, but I think this is a vitally important interview. We're going to be discussing his most recent book, Unraveling the COVID Con, which is a compilation of the hundreds, and I mean hundreds, because I've read and watched almost every single one of them about COVID. So I think you definitely, as a listener, you're going to want to hear what he has to say. Ken doesn't make this stuff up. He's constantly researching, talking to people, interviewing, and learning really what is going on. So with all that, welcome, Ken. Thanks for coming back.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, if you would, I guess I hate to make you recount it, but tell me about how did COVID first come on your radar, and what was your initial perceptions when, you know, it first came in the news, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I was looking at all the Chinese news stories as everybody was, and if you can recall, and it's hard to recall, but you could, we can if we think hard. There was a time when it looked like this mystery virus was just limited to China. There was even some nonsensical thing that it only affected Chinese people. I don't know if people remember that, but that was actually a news item. But I remember thinking, wow, I know Wuhan. Wuhan's the most polluted city on the planet Earth, maybe by a factor of 10. It's so polluted that it creates air pollution problems in other countries. It's a bad place. So I was wondering why they were getting their knickers in a knot by one respiratory death of a guy who was in his 50s. You know, Chinese guys smoke a lot. Like, there is no political correctness when it comes to tobacco in China. And so this guy was a heavy smoker. He was already quite sick. He lived in Wuhan, and he died of a respiratory disease. And I thought, how is that news?
Ken. Quick question. Have you been to Wuhan? And
no, but I have a lot of friends. I have a lot of friends that do business over there. They get things manufactured, and they were telling me horror stories. Like, one guy said, Ken, they don't have birds. I haven't seen a bird ever when I was in China anywhere. And I guess if you go out in mountains or something, you'll find some birds. But it's a pretty rough, polluted place in general. And Wuhan apparently is the epicenter of pollution. The way they get rid of their trash is they have this massive municipal incinerator. And so the place literally smells like burning trash 24/7. Yeah, not pleasant, right? And people were wearing masks in Wuhan just to get to and from work, not because of any disease, just because the air was so bad. So there's another thing. People may remember or may not remember again because so much has happened, but Hong Kong was coming apart at the seams right before this virus thing started. I mean, the Chinese were really having trouble keeping Hong Kong under their thumb. And what wasn't reported is that Wuhan had its own political problems. The people there were getting sick and tired of the pollution. They were really sick of this incinerator. They were sick of breathing, poisonous fumes all day. They had their own protests, not on the scale of Hong Kong, but significant protests. So it was very convenient. And that's what I thought initially. I thought, oh, wow, this is really convenient. The communists can shut down Hong Kong. They can shut down Wuhan and, cool out all this civil disturbance. But on the scientific basis, basis of this. I just couldn't understand why one guy dying of a respiratory disease was news. And then, of course, there's the question of how do they even identify what the virus was that quickly? How did they know it was deadly even? I mean, it's like there's so many. I'll confess, I'm not a scientist, but I do know that normally science takes time, and they didn't take any time at all.
Yeah, no, it's true. It does take a long time. I mean, even if you get sick, what they think is a bacterial infection or a virus, there's no culturing to see what it really is. I mean, in very limited cases, but if you get sick, they just give you broad spectrum antibiotics. So like even now, today, 2022, in the US, they still don't even do most of the testing that they could do to actually help people with what's wrong with them. So how could they do that for this?
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Some guy who was not an unlikely candidate to die of a respiratory disease, dies of a respiratory disease, and suddenly they go full bore, putting the entire scientific edifice of China behind finding this virus. Well, how do they even know it was a virus? I mean, it's kind of madness. And then the second phase, there were two phases, three phases. And most of us, when it was happening in China, were like, wow, I'm sure glad I don't live in China. Those people are crazy, Then it came to Italy, which made a certain amount of sense because there's a lot of trade between, China's big in textiles, and Italy is a huge repository of textile knowledge. They're like some of the best textile people in the universe. And so there's just a lot of back and forth between two countries. And so it kind of made sense. And a lot of those mills are up in northern Italy, which is the most industrialized part, not only of Italy, but of all of southern Europe. So then the next phase of the show was Italy. And what they didn't tell you about Italy was the following. Number one, that part of Italy, because it was bifurcated. They did not have mass death events in the south of Italy. They only seem to happen in the north. And the north is a valley. It's a huge valley. And it has a lot of air pollution problems as well. It's one of the most industrialized parts of all of Europe, definitely the most industrialized part of southern Europe. It's got the oldest demographic in all of Europe. And like other places, everybody smokes. The other thing is they have and I have this in the book, it's for a couple of pages, I reproduced some of my tweets. And I wish I had my book handy and I would tell you, but it's something like they have 2 hospital beds per 100,000, where Korea has 14, Yeah. So apparently every winter there is a overflow of the hospitals with elderly people coming in with respiratory diseases. And I also had the experience of getting sick in New York City. I got a really strong stomach flu once, and I was pretty sturdy and healthy at the time, and I literally could barely walk. I mean, it just hit me out of the blue, and I thought I was having a heart attack. I didn't know what it was, So I went to an emergency room. There was no, national emergency or citywide emergency. I was on a gurney in the hallway for 6 hours after waiting 2 hours in the waiting room just to be seen by anybody. So
there's a joke about like Bellevue in New York. People would die in the hallway or die in the waiting room. They'd be there for days.
I could totally see it. So that was, of course, the third phase was, first it hit China, then it hit Italy, then it hit New York. And there was all kinds of obvious chicanery around the New York story. For instance, they said they were parking refrigerator trucks outside the hospitals. They were taking photographs of them. Well, I know what a refrigerator truck looks like. It's got to have the refrigerator stuff attached to it. These were just regular trailer trucks. Right. So they were lying there. Then they were going on and on about, oh, my God, they're digging mass graves on an island off New York. Well, yeah, they've been doing that for the last 160 years. It's called Potter's Field. It's where you get buried if you don't have loved ones that have the money to bury you, which is a lot. By the way, that's a lot of people in New York City cannot afford a burial. So it's not at all unusual for them to basically bulldoze a hole and put in a whole bunch of wooden caskets at the same time. But instead of telling the truth, they had a drone flying over the burial, and they go, oh my God, look what we've discovered. It's like, you didn't discover anything. This is how people get buried there. The other thing that was true, but they misled people as to why bodies were backing up in the hospitals. And that is because they closed the funeral homes. And, you got to think logistics, right? It's like when somebody dies in a hospital, normally the funeral home comes by, or the city, if they don't have a family who can pay, and the body's removed. What happens if you've closed or slowed down the operation of all the funeral homes dramatically? Well, within a week, the bodies are going to start piling up in the hospital morgue.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Right. But of course they presented it as, oh my God, the bodies are piling. Yeah, the bodies are piling up. You're not removing them like you normally do. I mean, yeah, it's just, so there was a lot of obvious lying. So I saw the China thing, which didn't make sense to me. I saw the Italy thing, which they managed to leave out a few really important facts. Then there were some weird things, like they were recycling Ebola footage and representing it as what was going on in Italy. And there's a lot of weird Ebola recycling. So for instance, all those really fancy suits that are taped up, you ever seen them where it's like a white suit? Yeah, those are recycled from the Ebola scare. Remdesivir, of course, is it a failed Ebola drug? That was the drug that Fauci said was going to save the world. That apparently it seems like it's killing people left and right. What else? There was another weird Ebola hangover. It's like they try one scam and it doesn't work, so they just recycle it. They get the same props. My favorite though was a photo in Italy, right? And you have these two guys suited to the max. It looks like they were on their way to the moon, and you're like, oh my God! And standing behind them were two guys in suits, not dressed up at all, and I guess whoever took the photograph forgot to frame them out of the picture. You know what I mean? So one, it didn't make sense. The narrative didn't make sense. And two, they were obviously pushing the narrative really, really hard. Well, here's one. You're from New York, right?
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Yeah,
I was born and raised there.
Yeah. Okay. Did you ever hear a siren when you were in New
every
York?
day?
Right, every day. I grew up
every day to hear sirens constantly.
Yeah, I grew up partially in the Bronx, and I can remember lying in bed at night as a kid and just hearing sirens all day and night. And so that was the other thing. They said, oh my God, every time you hear a siren, it's another COVID death. Well, no, it could be a police siren. It could be a fire siren. It could be an EMT siren for someone that broke their leg. We don't know what these sirens are for. But if you're from Kansas, you would think, oh my God, that's a lot of sirens. Well, if you're right, so a lot of prevarication. So that's kind of what got me. And then, of course, you start talking to real doctors and real scientists, and they're like, yeah, we don't understand what they're saying here. This doesn't make sense.
Yeah, one question. So we were talking about this offline. I mean, the amount of corruption you've exposed in different fields is it's unbelievable. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of things you found. At what point did you look at this and say, oh no, they're really going for it? It's taken hold. Like, this appears to be an obvious scam, and they're really going for it. At what point did you realize that, and why?
I didn't really get it until they locked us down, and that's when I went, oh boy, people are really buying this. Because think about it, never. I mean, there is a thing called quarantines, right? And if you're sick with something, you are often quarantined, kept away from other people. Yes, it is historically true that during the Middle Ages, if you sailed into the harbor at Venice, they would quarantine you for a while just to make sure you hadn't brought anything bad. I think they did the same thing at Ellis Island. I get that, sort of. But never before in the history of humanity, maybe in the history of the galaxy, maybe in the history of the universe, have healthy people been told they had to quarantine. And certainly never has the entire population been told they had to quarantine. So when I saw that, I saw we were really off the rails. And then, of course, when the 2 weeks turned to another 2 weeks, which turned to 2 months, which turned to 2 years, then I knew, oh my God, they got us. They really did it this time.
So what else early on did you see that just made no sense, that maybe people were not aware of?
Well, I mean, the fake masks, the cloth masks. That was ridiculous. Everybody make a mask. That was a psyop, a psychological operation. Let's get everybody busy making masks. And they, we'll kind of recreate the war, the kind of a war effort mentality where everybody's pitching in and making masks. And, it was a lovely image, but, I think it's pretty obvious to anybody who knows anything that a cloth mask isn't going to do squat. And
yeah, stories about respirator makers, same thing. They had stories about mask makers. They had stories about, they they turned getting the vaccine into like a patriotic thing, doing the duty. You're right. There was a lot of that going on.
Yeah, and the other thing is they said very early on. I mean, they said from the get-go, like on the day they were shutting everything down, they said, until a vaccine is developed. And I'm like, what? What do you mean until a vaccine is developed? Number one, it takes years to develop a vaccine safely. And so that's number one. And number two, who's to say we're not going to come up with a therapy? And I have video somewhere of Fauci really early on in April doing he's being interviewed by the AMA's video podcast, and he's saying, no, there will be no therapy. I'm like, how the hell do you know? There's a big planet of doctors and scientists out there. Somebody might actually come up with something, Tony, but they were focused on the vaccine from day one. And they were and I think their goal was to keep us as miserable as possible so that when the vaccine was finally ready, they could tell us, hey, get the vaccine and you'll never have to wear a mask again. Remember that? I mean, we'd have, and hey, if you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask, but if you are, you must wear a mask. It was just, and then here in New York State, they had kids in masks until, I don't know, May. Children.
Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button, and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up. And check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Oh, they still do, Ken. I still see it around. Sick families, mentally ill that still put masks on their kids. I still see it.
Oh, are you seeing this in Texas?
Yeah, it's not a lot. Like I express everything as, like, at least with this in terms of percentages. For a while, everyone wore masks. Then it finally started going down and down. It reached a low of like 30%. Then it ramped up again. Then it went down to maybe 10%. And then the past 2-3 months, I've seen it creeping back up to like 15%. But it includes families with kids, and it's a sickness. I see that. I just see pure mental illness.
I mean, would I if I were a legislator, I would call mask wearing a medical procedure, which I guess it is because we're supposedly wearing it based on medical advice. And it does, and this I learned really early on. This was in March from a friend of mine. He's a painter, not a fine arts painter, but a industrial painter. He goes and he paints huge projects, and he's a member of the union. And he said, Ken, you got to understand, I'm not allowed to wear a mask on the job. No, forget COVID. We're talking about pre-COVID. I'm not allowed to, even if I'm in an area where you'd kind of want to wear a mask, right? Because of fumes, lack of ventilation. He goes, we're not allowed to wear masks on the job until we've gone to a doctor. The doctor has examined us and signed off that we're healthy enough to wear a mask all day. I'm like, really? He goes, yeah, that's how it is. And so I'm like, oh, so now they're just going to put everybody in a mask without any analysis or evaluation of their health at all. I'm like, wow, that's interesting. Yeah, it's just, and now, of course, it's pretty clear. And then, of course, this safe and effective. Well, it's certainly not effective, and it doesn't appear to be safe if you look at the VAERS database.
So when you started posting about this and based on the comments coming back to you, based on your posts, what kind of picture did you get of the mental state of people?
My first post on this was actually a tweet, and it was February 1st, 2020. And I was just pointing out to everybody, I'm like, guys, Wuhan is the most air polluted place in the world, maybe in human history. And the other thing too, it's got 11 million people. Like, if one guy dies in a population of 11 million, that should not have been news. That should have been, next.
Right.
So that was my first post. I got doctors, MDs, some of them, telling me how wrong I was, how horrible I was. I was involved in an operation here to stop what would have been North America's second largest coal-fired cement plant that was going to be built just 40 miles from my house. And it was like a done deal. Like they had bought off every politician, every news outlet, including the National Public Radio affiliate. And nobody wanted to hear about any opposition. And people in the town that were opposed to it were afraid to put signs against it. And, coal is dirty, obviously, and cement plants are, they're right up there with oil refineries and chemical plants. They're really dirty, but we prevailed. We fought for 7 years and we actually won, but here's where I'm telling you the story. The guy that I coached from day one, not literally day one, but like day 2, day 3, when the group only had 40 members. And when I was done with them, they had 4,000 paid members, and they were one of the biggest political forces in this county. He called me up and made a point of telling me what an awful human being I was. So that was an experience I had. I had I had a customer who's also a guy that used to speak at my events, tell me, how dare you speak against vaccinations? Vaccinations have changed the world, And maybe, I don't know. I don't know that people need to have 72 of them before they're 18. I'm not sure that's really necessary. But yeah, so but you know what? I didn't get. Oh yeah, and then we had a neighbor, a friend of my wife, who, when she found out we weren't vaccinated, said, "Well, I feel compelled to tell everybody that you're not vaccinated." We're like, okay.
Oh my God. What did you do with that?
To my wife's credit, she told that woman in no uncertain terms that you have no right to violate my medical privacy.
But I told her I feel compelled to sue you if you do that.
I was on the board of the largest social services nonprofit in Ulster County, which is across the river from me. It's like where Woodstock is. And they had a committee meeting of the personnel committee, and they presented at the board meeting, and they were like, "Well, what are we going to do about these employees that are claiming religious exemptions?" And then the guy who was presenting the report said, "Yeah, I read their things, and they're all quoting the same section of the Bible. I don't even think they understand the Bible at all, And I was livid. And I said, hey, number one, these people deserve our respect, period. And 2, are you going to personally take care of anybody that has an adverse reaction? Then I wrote a letter to the board and I said, okay, I agree with you. You're right. We need some procedures. We need to have a list of approved religions, right? It can't just be any old religion. It's got to be the religions that we think are valid. Then you have to take a test to validate that you actually have sufficient knowledge of your religion to have a religious exemption. And I think if we put those 2 things in place, then I'm on board, and of course everybody realized this is absurd. So I'm pleased to say that our little nonprofit, well, not so little, 180 employees, our nonprofit did not compel its low income, low wage, hard-working people to engage in a vaccine program that they didn't want to be part of. But it wasn't all bad. We have a lot of friends, like beautifully, my neighbor to the left of me and my neighbor to the right of me also agree that this was utter bullshit. We didn't wear masks. We didn't do anything.
Oh, good. Yeah, I went out during the, whatever lockdown things they had. They were still like, everything was drive-through, but I would get coffee. I'd go walk around. It was like, I don't know, living in, what do they call it? When the whole world comes to an end.
The apocalypse.
Post-apocalyptic times. Yeah, like there were certain nice things. You could walk around and exercise. No one bothered you. No one was around. But it was just sad to see everyone so, terrified. Literally, some people were terrified of this. It's just terrible.
Well, and we had it pretty easy in the U.S. A friend of mine who's based in Israel told me they banned surfing. And then another friend of mine who's doing some writing for me, she's got an amazing, I'm going to publish this someday. She's got an amazing account of all the police stuff all over the world. And, they had drones that were flying around broadcasting messages in Australia to people that were designed to take people's temperatures and do facial recognition. And I mean, that's a mystery. And I don't know when that will be solved, but how did those drones get purchased, programmed, trained, and deployed so fast?
Yeah, they must have had them at the ready.
You'd think, right?
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true.
So it's been a wild ride, and it's not over yet. So now where I live in the cultural sphere of New York City. I'm 100 miles from New York City, but we get a lot of New Yorkers up here, and we get a lot of the New Yorker mentality. And you know this, like, is there any more hypochondriacal person in the world than a typical New Yorker?
Fortunately, if you live there and you get to be in your 40s, by that time you're a grizzled, miserable wretch. So I'm glad I left.
Yeah,
because that's just what it was. I look at my driver's license picture and I still have the original one from when I first came, and I look horrible. Now I'm so much happier and more relaxed not being there, and I don't want to ever go back there again. But yeah, I mean, that's what it was typical.
So we have a lot more mask wearing around here than would be normal for the U.S. But we got this crazy thing. I don't know if it's happening in Texas. We've got people afraid of monkeypox. Now, why they're wearing masks to avoid monkeypox, I don't know. I mean, I think the way, I'm not being mean and I'm not being homophobic, but I think the way to avoid monkeypox is don't go to orgies. I'm sorry to say that seems to be where these things are emanating. And God bless those guys. Let them have all the fun they can muster. But that seems to be where this thing emanates from, you know?
You know, what I saw early on is everyone was confused about what to do. Everyone was, in a way, left to their own devices. You know, some stores wouldn't even let you in. Some stores would let you in, but only with a mask. Some stores you had to do this. Some stores, everyone just kind of did different things because I think they just didn't know what to do. And there was never any real like guidance, come and go. And I think people still are in a state of confusion and they feel abandoned. So yeah, that's why I think some of them wear masks because they think it'll protect them, and some of them do this and that. None of it makes any sense. None.
And then now we've got one case of polio, which, by the way, could have been caused by the polio vaccine itself. It's not unheard of for people to get polio after getting the polio vaccine. In fact, it's not unheard of for other family members to get polio from the shedding person that's gotten vaccinated. But anyway, we have one case of polio in New York State, and now there are people here wearing masks because they're afraid of polio. I'm like, oh my God. I mean, it's sad. It's sad. You know, and it's like, the other thing that tipped me off that they were not serious, they weren't trying to help or protect anybody, is, you know, they had advertisements running on TV. They had billboards. They had flashing lights. They had posters everywhere. How many commercials, which they could have easily done, I think every news channel would have gladly given 30 seconds an hour. How many times did they show people the correct way to wash their hands? I don't remember ever seeing that.
I used to joke and say, how come they don't say, you know, help us fight the, you know, COVID? Make sure to spend time with friends and family, get out in the sun 15 minutes a day, have good sleep and vitamin D and magnesium, maintain your health as best you can, and exercise. It was the polar opposite. It was all the worst things you could do to make yourself worse instead of help you. That's what all the advice was.
And, you know, I looked up some history of, there was a flu outbreak right after World War II in England, and the signs were completely different. They were like, if you feel you have symptoms, stay home and rest, please. You know? And I thought to myself, well, let's see, a couple of years before this flu outbreak, these people were in the tube getting bombed by the Luftwaffe. So maybe they had perspective on what a real risk was versus, you know, a manageable risk. But the signs were commonsensical. They acted as if people had intelligence. Terror and fear will also reduce your immune system. So they were, you know, weren't letting people go out, weren't letting people exercise, you know, terrorizing. They kept the liquor stores open, and of course,
that's important.
And you know, of course, predictably, you know, we've had more deaths from alcohol in the last 2 years than ever in history. Same thing with drug overdoses by death by drug overdose.
So what else did you notice? Were there other turning points in the psyche of people that you observed? Like, you know, if you're able to step back and observe it from that vantage point, what did you see as things went on?
The fact that people went along with the lockdown at all and didn't say this is ridiculous, and then the fact that they allowed it to continue. These were sort of breakage points, you know, where you could just see the society was breaking. You know, people were losing their common sense. I think the problem, you know, demographically is twofold. One, you know, we do skew toward an older population. You know, we've got a gray society. You know, I mean, look at our president. It's like, are you kidding me? Are you serious with this guy? You know, and yet he's president of the United States. Every day I meditate on that. It's like, this guy's president, and the next in line is a woman who literally can't string two sentences together, whose only talent seems to be she was the girlfriend of Willie Brown when he was mayor of San Francisco, and that's how she got her entree into politics. I mean, it's not a good thing. But anyway, so older people in general, and it's not a rule, because there are a lot of in fact, there were so many, not a lot, but every now and then the newspapers would deign to publish a letter from people in their 70s and 80s during this thing, and they stopped pretty quick. And these people were saying, don't shut down society on our behalf, okay? we'll take care of ourselves. Thank you very much. We don't need to see people suffering like this. But in any event, we do have an older population, and there's a percentage of that population that's really worried about themselves. And I'm afraid that was one of the things that helped push this. Yes, that was one of the populations that was active because you had people demanding the masks. Those were the most vocal. Unfortunately, those were the most vocal people. People that were against masks somehow didn't manage to get organized. In some places they did. So
right, but they were shouted down. I mean, yeah.
Well, not only shouted down, but there was a case of one guy up in Canada that wanted to keep Canadians were really abused by their government. He wanted to keep his fitness center open. And I think they sent 36 police cars to, arrest him.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
you can't be allowed to keep people fit. I mean, that's the worst of all.
Yeah. So I guess there was two levels to this. One is seeing these obvious media frauds, and then seeing the society just breaking down. One, when they accepted the lockdowns. Two, when they accepted the perpetuation of them. Three, when they accepted the enforced masking. Because, of course, we remember we were told we didn't need masks, and then we were told we had to have masks, and they had to wear them all the time.
Yep.
And then terrible things like people not understanding and wearing masks indoors, and some people wore masks while they were sleeping. But who knows how many billions? It's got to be tens of billions of dollars in advertising, promotion, scaremongering they spent. Couldn't they have spent some money educating people? Hey, when you're home, you can, wash your hands thoroughly. People weren't even advised to keep their windows open. Get fresh air. It's really, if I ever had any doubts what the elites think of people, I have no more doubts about that. They don't care about us one shred. And of course, when there's the picture of Gavin Newsom having the dinner party, at this place where I've been, it's $200 a seat.
Oh, the French Laundry.
The French Laundry, and nobody's wearing masks. And then that knucklehead in England, Boris Johnson, having a big party with no masks. And now Trudeau, was recently, filmed getting off a plane in Costa Rica for vacation with no mask. It's just, these people are beyond belief. But it buttered way too many people's. The other demographic that was the problem for us as a country, as a nation, is that I think like half of Americans are getting a government paycheck of some kind or another. Either they're a teacher, or they're working for the county or the state or the city or the town or the feds, or every year a higher and higher percentage of Americans are government employees. And, it's a nice job. You get paid, and, there's no layoffs, and you have a nice pension, and all right, I got to wear a mask, but okay, I'll do it. If because the boss is telling me, your boss is the government. So yeah. I think so, between the fact that our demographic is skewed older, and older people to a degree, some of them have exaggerated worries about their health. And then you have all these, and then of course the journalists got paid. The lawyers, if you're a defense attorney or a DWI attorney or an ambulance guy, not personal injury attorney, that business kept going. So those guys kept getting paid. The doctors kept getting paid. The nurses kept getting, so there were these whole segments of society that had no financial worry at all. All they had to do was wear a mask. I had to do something that involved an attorney. It was relatively early on. It was probably still March 2020. We went to his office for a meeting, and he had a mask on. And I said, this is bullshit, right? He goes, I just do what they tell me.
Well, nowadays, it makes me laugh. The places that still require it, now it's individual businesses, but it's all medical places. I went to go to the skin doctor 2 months ago. And they're like, oh, you need to wear a mask. I'm like, no, I don't. No, I'm not. I said, you want the money for my consult? Fine. I'm not wearing it. If not, I'm leaving. Your choice.
Wow.
So they go in the back. They're like, oh, okay. They'll see you. I said, you guys are in the medical industry. Do you even know what the pore size in the mask is versus the size of a virus? I'm like, do you know anything about medicine? I told them. They're like, it's crazy that's the industry that's the most demented still about this.
Remember that movie Idiocracy? Did you ever see? Yeah, and he goes to visit a doctor, and the doctor's like an absolute blithering idiot, and is freaked out because he didn't have his vaccine tattoo. If you remember that, if you ever, it's a scary movie. But this is interesting. Now, UK has national health, but part of their system they have a bunch of hospitals that are affiliated with Cambridge University. Pretty good school. You know, it's not a third tier school. They stopped masks in their hospital for everybody, patients, doctors, nurses, back in June of this year.
Oh, well, good.
Yeah,
it's pretty late still. Yeah,
it's late, but at least they did it.
So what kind of permanent damage do you think has been done, and what does that look like?
Well, I mean, I think there's always people who have a proclivity to develop phobias. You know, and they're on the edge, and this just pushed. You know, I think that a lot of people, you know, we have in the best of times, we have kind of a shattered society. You know, like families are kind of, you know, some families are intact, but a lot are not. How many kids are being raised by single moms? And that's not to slam the single moms. I mean, that's just the situation they're in, you know. But that's not optimal. That's not optimal, right. You know. And so you have that. That's millions of kids. And that's strain on the mother, that's strain on the children. We don't really have the extended family anymore. You know, some families do have it, but you know, things are so we kind of have a shattered society to begin with, which means people are weak. I'm reading, I was just today reading about, can't remember the guy's name, but he spent 30 years studying induced helplessness, right? This is a science guy at a university. I'm like,
he asked him why he couldn't help himself.
Exactly. But I'm like, now you talk about depressing. Could you imagine every day going to work and inducing learned helplessness in all kinds of different laboratory creatures and human beings? I mean, for 30 years, you know, God, talk about trauma. But anyway, he did a study with lambs. I didn't know lambs were lab animals, but I guess in this place they were. And bottom line is what they were doing, the classic learned helplessness test, learned helplessness experiment is you have a floor that gives shocks, right? And so the poor animal is in there and you just shock it randomly and it has no idea how to protect itself, has no idea what's going on, and it becomes despondent and depressed. So they did it, and the interesting thing was if a young lamb had its mother with him or her, they did not develop learned helplessness even in this horrific situation. It was the ones that were isolated that developed the problem. So we have a lot of isolated people in our society. We don't have a real warm, touchy-friendly society. And I wish I had the stats here, and I wish I remember what the source was, but it was really interesting. They were talking about the number of touches people get in the course of a day, and they were ranking it by country. And of course, Latin America has a lot. You know, U.S. was way down there, like to a ridiculous degree, and the lowest number of touches per day was UK. You know, we're just not a very touchy-feely society. So anyway, my point is our society is kind of shattered in a way. There's a lot of people that aren't getting that aren't enjoying the normal props that an intact, healthy society would give them. And when you have a mass insanity like this was, that's enforced by the media and the government, and in some cases the police, it's going to push those people over the edge. So we see the stats. What was it? At some point, even the CDC, the crooked CDC, admitted that suicide attempts among teenage girls were up 51%.
Yeah.
Even 5% would be a cause for alarm. 51% is off. It's off the hook. It's like inconceivable. So, you know, and that's, so yeah, there's going to be a lot of people. And where's the help for these people? You know, where's the help?
No one cares. Yeah. I mean, look at, like I've told people about the VAERS database and they just go, oh, they just shrug. Or you know, anything you can say, people just like, oh, I'm going to get my 55th booster. It's killed God knows how many people. Oh, well, it would have been worse if I didn't have it. It's just like, it's just amazing to me that people just say whatever they were told to think. It's crazy.
I saw a clip, and I don't know if you've had a chance to see it. I posted it. Apparently, there was a study in Australia, and this was a government study, that I can't even believe this number. It's so high that you're 37 times more likely to have a bad outcome if you've been vaccinated.
That's what I mean. I just wonder what it's gotten to the point where, I don't know, do you think people are just demoralized, or again, you talked about learned helplessness. Like, what do you think is the mental state of a lot of people right now?
I would say down. But on the other hand, there's a lot of resilience too. I mean, a lot of people are getting back to normal, to, you know, and back to business, back to play. I was so happy to see we have a youth rec program in our village, and all the kids go to it, and they go and they play all day together, and then they go home. And I was driving by just as it was dispersing, and you could see there were like 80. Our village is pretty small, and there were like 80 kids. I'm like, this is great. This is great. So, people are resilient to a degree, unless they're not. But, we're very social creatures. And if we're lucky enough to have a good social network, we can bounce back from a lot. I just worry about the people that don't have, there's a lot of elderly people living alone. That was a problem before COVID. And now they're alone, and they're being told if they breathe the wrong way, they're going to die. And yeah.
Yeah, I've heard about, deaf people and sign language and having to wear a mask. There's been a lot of trauma in that community because it's very hard for them to communicate. That's like primary way is facial expressions, lips, etc. It's not just the signs. So yeah, it's been a lot of terrible things that have been done to people.
Yeah, and then you do see these flyers up. Call the hotline. Okay, that's something. But I don't know that that's really commensurate with the degree of injury that's been done.
So what's happened to your perception over time? But in the beginning, you thought one thing, and then after a few months, you thought another. And what were you thinking a year out? What were you thinking now?
Well, I'm fighting. I'm not thinking. I'm thinking that we better stop this and turn it around. We better figure out how to do it, or this is going to go on till the end of time.
Yeah, that was another weird thing. Is magically all of a sudden, once the Ukraine stuff started, COVID's just disappeared. Or at least for a little while, they said nothing.
We have this local paper I love local journalism, and it's a physical paper, and I want to support them, but they have a banner. They ran a banner on the head of their paper above the fold for every issue. And I can't remember the exact words, but the paraphrase was basically get vaccinated or die. I mean, it was literally that dramatic, and they ran it every week. And so one day I wrote them and I said, can you tell me who on your staff is a doctor? And on what basis are you giving medical advice to people you've never met? And well, you're the first person that's ever raised that issue. I'm like, well, okay, well, I'm the first person that ever raised it. But how do you do it? But here's the punchline. As soon as Ukraine started, that came off the banner, and now this is even crazier. Well, I don't know, crazier. Maybe it's not, but it's in the ballpark of crazy. We stand with America and Ukraine. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm not going to spend, we have spent our tax dollars on Ukraine. We apparently do have some military advisors in Ukraine, though we've done the nice favor to them of literally sending small missile systems that are 40 years old, whose, they're battery operated, whose batteries died and became totally malfunctioning years ago. So we basically cleared out our inventory of junk munitions, hauled it, valued it. And so when we said, hey, we're giving $40 billion to the Ukraine, it wasn't cash. It was like, well, let's get all that junk out of the warehouse, send it to Ukraine, and call it, $5 billion worth of missiles. So we're not doing the Ukrainian people any favors at all. Let's remember, too, before this all happened, the Ukraine was considered the most corrupt state in Europe. How many bioweapons labs are they running for us? I mean, that finally came out, even in a congressional hearing. It is a major child trafficking hub in the world. Their military is absolutely infused with, they call them neo-Nazis. I don't know why they put neo in front of them. These guys are Nazis. Oh my God. You have to remember, like, when the Germans occupied the Ukraine, they employed Ukrainians to run the country for them. So there's there's multi-generational Nazis in the Ukraine. Like, they were working for the Nazis during World War II. It'd be like, your grandfather was on board with the Nazi program because there were a lot of people in his neighborhood he didn't personally like, and the Nazis were willing to eliminate them, and they were going to give him a paycheck. So there were tens of thousands of Ukrainian collaborators working with the Nazis throughout the whole of World War II. Yeah.
So that survives to this very day, you're saying?
Oh, well, some of that stuff's generational, No, but you really should look it up. I forget the name of the unit, but there's an actual unit in the military of Ukraine that carries a sort of a adapted version of the swastika. Let me see if I can look up the name for you. And these guys are not just a couple of random malcontents. Like, they are everywhere in the Ukrainian military. Let's see if Google will allow me to access information on these guys. Here we go. 2018 from Reuters. Okay.
Mhm.
Ukraine's neo-Nazi problem.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, it's called the Azov Battalion.
Azov, that's right. Yeah.
The Azov Battalion. They were, this is just like kind of what happened in Yugoslavia. You had this group called the KLA that was running the Kosovo rebellion, basically. And the KLA had been designated a terrorist group by the European Union. They were known to be running drugs. They were known to be criminal thugs. And then suddenly, because they were doing something that was helpful to us, they became war heroes. So it's just the same. Yeah, the Azov Battalion, the neo-Nazis of the Ukraine. There are people that in Europe that really think that it would have been a better thing if the Nazis had not lost. That they had the right. They were against Jews. They're against immigrants, and that's the right thing. These people feel.
Again, 2 years into it, I've asked you this before, probably about a year ago, maybe a little bit more, but what was the game plan behind all this? And who are the puppet masters, and what is the game plan? As of a year ago, and have you resolved?
I think it's pretty clear that this guy, Klaus Schwab, and the World Economic Forum in Davos, which we were all laughing at for years because they seemed so ridiculous. Well, you know what? If you read the history, we laughed at Hitler in the 30s too. He was considered ridiculous and somebody who was going to disappear and was ultimately not going to be of much account. Well, you see how that turned out. And I think it's the same thing with Schwab and the World Economic Forum. I mean, they have literally been cultivating young politicians,
including Putin.
Was that apparently?
Putin.
Apparently.
I think he's one of their proteges.
Oh my God!
Turned on them.
I mean, I really hope there's somebody, not in their camp. But Xi, the head of China, he's a World Economic Forum guy. I mean, he's not one of their proteges, but he goes to their meetings and speaks. They love him. And Trudeau, obviously, in Canada, is one of their people. The guy I don't know if you're aware, because it's not reported in the news, but the head of the Netherlands just declared that they were going to nationalize 1/3 of, or some I forget the exact percentage, but I think it was as much as 1/3 of all Netherlands farmland, and revert it to nature as a way of helping avoid climate change. Did you know that?
I know. I've seen some of the tyranny that's been going on there. Yeah, it's just.
Yeah,
it seems like Europe and the U.S. are just literally shooting themselves in the foot, and the other foot, and the hand, and then the head, and it's just insane.
I mean, we've always had weak, venal, meaning corruptible, submoron politicians. That's always been the case. And normally they're bribed by, local contractors, local consultants that want to get, juicy consulting deals. But now they're being bribed wholesale by people with a lot of money and a lot of ambition. I imagine one of them is George Soros. I really haven't looked into the Soros thing, though he does seem to be funding a lot of lunatic activity. But clearly the World Economic Forum is a huge problem. And the program that all these lunatics are enforcing, whether it's they're shutting down the energy industry in Canada. I mean, what? Are you kidding me? But they're doing it. That's all World Economic Forum stuff. They had somehow conned the farmers of Sri Lanka into the idea that if they cold turkey went organic, and I'm all for organic. I think we could be doing way more of that. And I saw a really interesting paper recently that said, look, if you mix some organic practices, you can actually reduce the amount of chemical fertilizer you need. I'm all for that, right? But you can't. What's that?
I am too, but not for mandating it with no research, no reasoning, no nothing behind it.
Well, you can't cold turkey it. I mean, for better or worse, we are dependent, and if we're going to get off, we have to do it in a measured way. So I don't know if you know, in Sri Lanka, they basically told the farmers, because we have some education at least, and so we have some degree of skepticism. But when you're in some of these undeveloped countries, and you're a farmer, you know what you learned from your parents and your grandparents, But then some guy with a fancy suit, who seems to have all the money in the world tells you, here's the modern way. There was a situation not that long ago, 15, 20 years ago, where they had conned a bunch of Indian farmers into going, with the GMOs and the Roundup and everything. And it was failing. And these guys were killing themselves because that they had bet the farm based on the inducements of this nonsense, and they bet the farm and lost. Bet the farm and lose in those countries, you're not coming back. Like it's it's like in the U.S. you can get on welfare. Maybe some of your other relatives have a little bit of money, but in these other countries, there's no margin for error. So anyway, it was interesting that the people in Sri Lanka rose up and actually literally surrounded the presidential palace in an ocean of people, and all the heads of that country had to flee.
I just recently interviewed a guy in Panama. He said there's been gas shortages and riots. Another guy in Ecuador, same thing. I've spoken to some people in Pakistan. They're having unrest. We're starting to see it in a lot of places in the world. And of course, the news says nothing.
It's extraordinary, how they manage not to report it. Here's an interesting little thing that I got from one of my friends. So this guy had he's a really fascinating guy. New Yorker, grew up in Queens, rough guy, was in a gang, but straightened himself out, went to FIT, Fashion Institute Technology, got an associate degree in textile manufacturing. And at 19, he was traveling the world, helping build textile factories around the world. So this guy, and most of those, of course, they're in third world places because they're going after the low wage places. So this guy really knows the third world. You name the country, he's been there. You name the remote place, he's been there. Right? So he said to me, he's also, now he's back, he's here, he's doing other businesses, and now he's got some horses. I live in horse country, and he's got some horses, and he's gone, we're being told that there's a grain shortage for horses. He goes, that's bullshit. And I said, Joe, but I hear that, the Ukraine, they can't ship the wheat out of the Ukraine. He goes, listen to me, Ken. Every place I've been in this world, every place, I have seen bags of rice and wheat with grown in the USA stamped on them. We're the ones, and corn. We're the ones. It's not Ukraine. He goes, I've never been anywhere, a bag of wheat that had Ukraine. I'm sure the Ukraine does feed certain countries, and not getting the wheat out of the Ukraine is a problem for a regional thing. But if they're telling us that there's a shortage of grain and wheat and oats and all this kind of stuff, that's bullshit. Someone's creating the shortage because it's the U.S. that has been growing all this stuff all these years and exporting it everywhere. So that was very interesting. You get little pieces of reality from real people sometimes, like my friend that was the union painter. And he explained to me, because what did I know about masks? It didn't make sense. But when he said, Ken, I'm a grown man, and I'm not allowed to wear a mask on a job unless I've gone to the doctor and gotten a clean bill of health that I'm strong enough to wear a mask, And so here's a guy that's been all over the world telling me if there's a grain shortage, it's not because the grain's not coming out of Ukraine, because all the grain you see around the world has come out of the Midwest of the United States.
Well, Ken, I'm close to being out of time, but I do want to come back to your book. So where can people get it? Let's restate the name. And again, just a quick summary of what they'll get out of reading it.
Okay, I now have 2 books, and I'm working on a third. One of the books is called Unraveling the COVID Con. What it is my blog post starting in early March, and they're time-stamped, date-stamped, so you can see what I was saying when I was saying it. And it's a way of retracing, where we've been. This weird trip we've all been on the last 2+ years. So that's kind of a useful part of that book. Also, you'll appreciate this as a business person. It's like I had to do something I'm not going to make any money on this book, but something to monetize all these blog posts that I've been writing. So if anybody wants to see where we've been starting March 9th to, I think my last post was in June, and to see what was knowable. Because I point out the holes in the narrative from day one, right? But the second thing I've done that I'm very proud of is we've put out a 75th anniversary commemorative edition of the Nuremberg Code. And surprisingly, until we did it, there was no place that you could go to Amazon and buy a copy of the Nuremberg Code. So we are the first to have that.
You can buy Mein Kampf, so don't worry.
How do you like that, right? And let me tell you this. I did a Google search, and I typed in the string, 75th anniversary Nuremberg Code. How many results do you think I got?
0.
0. And then I typed in 70th anniversary Queen Elizabeth, 22 million. So, and then we're doing a third book called The Nuremberg Code and Its Modern Enemies. So everybody watch for that. But in the meantime, if you get my Nuremberg Code book, it'll remind you that book's coming, and you can actually have a copy of the Nuremberg Code in your own house. But one of the things we're doing in our third book, The Nuremberg Code and Its Enemies, is we're tracking all the reporters and nonprofits and fact-checking organizations that went on a blitz the last 2 years to tell us, and you might have missed this, but you'll see it in the book, to tell us that the Nuremberg Code does not apply to COVID. I mean, that was a cottage industry. I mean, I'm telling you, we haven't even been able to count so far. We haven't gotten to the end of the list of all the articles that were spewed in the last 2 years, not commemorating the Nuremberg Code, but telling us it didn't matter. And then, sorry to keep going on, but I want to tell you one other thing. I'm working with a woman who's an expert in this matters. I mean, she's a Holocaust victim personally, and she's been, studying this and working with scholars for over 20 years on this very subject. And she says virtually the day the Nuremberg Code was published, you had doctors saying it doesn't apply to us.
Huh.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so what website can people go to see all, your current blog posts, and what are some resources for listeners?
So if you go to kenmccarthy.com, KenMcCarthy.com, the normal spelling, you'll see a weird mix of my marketing articles and my COVID articles, because COVID just took over my life the last 2 years. And then if you go to Amazon and type in Ken McCarthy. By the way, there's another Ken McCarthy that writes novels. That ain't me. But you will see Unraveling the COVID Con. You will see the commemorative edition of the Nuremberg Code, and you will also soon see in September, you'll see our book, the Nuremberg Code and Its Modern Enemies, and we name names.
Okay. And last item, you always edit this out, but should we mention Brass Check or no?
Oh, yeah. And then I've been this sort of, not schizophrenic, but I've kept a firewall between my business and my alt reporting. And I've been doing the alt reporting since 97. And I call it Brass Check. It's in honor of Upton Sinclair and the great book he wrote about the news media, the critique he wrote of the news media called The Brass Check. And I've always kept those two things completely separate, because people that are interested in alternative news don't give a rat's ass about my business. And people that want to make more money from their businesses don't care about they don't care about me as an alternative news source. So I always kept these two things separate. But with COVID, I just felt like I can't keep them separate anymore. It's too complicated. So I do have a website called BrassCheck.com. We used to be all text, and then when the world went video, we went video. So if you go to BrassCheck.com, you'll see an archive of all of our print articles, which are many, hundreds of them. But if you go to if at the very top, you'll see, if you're looking for the video site, click here. The video site is our up-to-date current portage, and it's video based, because everybody loves video.
Okay, well, very good. Well, Ken, thanks for taking the time, and honestly, bottom of my heart, thank God for people like you, and thank you for what you do and covering all this terrible corruption. It's just never ending. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on. And life's never been a picnic. It's always been a struggle, and that's part of life. And so we're going to struggle. We're going to prevail.
Excellent.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at FindingGeniusPodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.
Brass Check TV, free to you, not free to us. We've got a server bill, we've got an email software bill, we've got a tech helper bill, and that happens every month. So to everybody that is supporting us financially, that's paying for their subscription in one way or another, we really appreciate it. If you're not, consider doing so. Everybody's got money for the newspaper and the cable bill and all that. Do you have money for media that's actually serving you? That's really the issue here. And when you help us, it allows us to get this information out to the world. So thanks to all our supporters, and if you're not a supporter already, please consider becoming one.